Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to class today. I have Professor Marty Martin from DePaul with us. He's been kind enough to share some of his comments. Most of his work's been in the healthcare space, so we're very fortunate to have him with us today. So Marty, thanks for joining us. If we could begin by you just giving us a little bit of your background in the work in healthcare and entrepreneurship, we'd really appreciate it.
No, I would love to. And thank you so much for me being able to kind of speak to your class. So my background is atypical for a typical business faculty member teaching entrepreneurship and management. I wound up in it accidentally. So I started off training as a clinical health psychologist and developed practices and sleep labs, and also worked on the corporate setting for innovative services, particularly when I was at Hopkins Hospital. So we launched a lot of global health services. So that's really the reason why I've kind of moved into this entrepreneurial space, because I've actually done it. And I think in some cases I can provide some value about the linkages between the two.
That's great. So we're kind of in some difficult times right now, and we thought a really good topic for you to talk to our entrepreneurship students about is describing failure and its effect on entrepreneurs, in your opinion.
Yeah. So when you think about failure, you can look at it from a couple of different angles. You can look at it from personal failure. So what did you do that perhaps was not the best decision, not the best resource allocation, or maybe you didn't manage your emotions well. I think from an entrepreneurial perspective, you can also look at it from business failure. So maybe you had to declare bankruptcy. Maybe you never launched. Maybe you didn't get that second round of funding. So I think for each and every one of you, you have to really define what failure means. But what I have found with small businesses and entrepreneurs, personal failure and even family failure and business failure are intertwined. Because if you don't have your act together physically and emotionally, then that's going to impact what happens in terms of your business. So for example, let's say that you're depressed and you're withdrawn and you're isolated, and you have low affect. How are you going to sell? How are you going to convince somebody to come work for you? How are you going to convince somebody to give you money? Because they may not know that you're depressed, but you're sending the signal to them is there's no energy here. So you may have a wonderful business model, wonderful pro formas, but what the energy you're sending out is, ugh. So I think you have to look at the failure from a holistic perspective.
That's a great point. I think you also raise an interesting issue that for entrepreneurs, there is really no difference between you and the business, right? I mean,
correct.
There's very little dividing line.
You are one.
Yes, right.
Yes.
One and the same.
Definitely.
So can you identify several reasons for failure, and how do you know when it's finally time to give up? There's so much on never give up, never give up, never give up. I think that was Winston Churchill, but yep. It's not really realistic in the entrepreneurial world. You kind of have to know, I think, when you start, when you're done, whether it's time or money or some other metric.
Yep. You're absolutely right. And let me share with you one failure experience that I had. So I tend to be optimistic, and there was a colleague of mine in Charlotte, North Carolina, that had this physical box. And this physical box was used for team development and teamwork training. So people were blindfolded and they had to do things as a group of 6 or 7 with this box that he made. So he was an engineer. So I experienced it myself, said, wow, this is fantastic. He presented this as a business opportunity, train the trainer, roll it out, sell it to organizations. So I paid a little bit of money for it. My wife, who's more of a pessimist, she said, this is a dumb idea. Why do you keep going to North Carolina? This is going nowhere. And I said, no, trust me. This thing is going to be big because it's totally experiential. It's novel. Just trust me. She was absolutely right. That thing was like dead in the water. So after about $50,000, almost embarrassed to say that, $50,000 on my end, you look at the travel, you look at the investment, the trainer, I had a decision because part of me was saying is, I just need to keep marketing, keep selling, and then it'll get some traction. But it would require some money to continue to do that, as well as time. So eventually I got to the point and said, I have to set a financial limit by which I'm not going to pay any more money. And that limit was $60,000. So that was my trigger. So as soon as I got to $10,000 more of expenses and they didn't yield any return, I cut it off. So I've begun to use that is what's the limit in time, hours, what's the limit in energy, what's the limit in money, what's the limit in resources, so that way you can execute the decision to cut it off. And that's what good traders do. Traders do that, is they'll put a certain amount of money at risk, but they have an exit strategy. So they know when they're getting out. But they develop that exit strategy before they get in, not while they're in, because emotions will kick in. So I think for me, that addresses the first part of your question is, how do you know when to cut it off? So you really need to think about that as you're launching or as you're growing, is when do I shut this puppy down? So I'll get to the other aspect, but just interested in any reactions from you about that.
No, I agree. Unfortunately, I had a friend once whose wife called me, and she had probably more money than he did, but it was his business, and
Yes.
they were taking their personal funds, and she called me up in a panic saying, I feel like I'm giving money to a gambler.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I can't seem to cut him off.
Yes.
It almost is an addictive behavior in
Mm-hmm.
that regard. And so I sat down and had a long talk with my friend Kirk, and
Yes.
we, agreed to a dollar limit, to your point.
Dollar
And
limit.
if
Yeah.
any more than that came out of their personal funds, he was done. And luckily, right before that last check was written, he was able to turn things around. But yeah,
So good.
that was a difficult lesson for them.
And I think it's important because people have a time limit, a dollar limit, or an energy limit in order to do it.
Right.
But let me go back to the question you said is some reasons why people fail. So I kind of put it in three buckets. So one is what I would call a deterministic approach. And the deterministic approach as to why people fail is they blame everything on external factors in the environment. So they say, oh, it was predestined, it was predetermined.
Not their fault.
Not their fault. Yep.
Right, of course
They
not.
never really look at themselves. Yep. So it was a bad economy. That's the reason why. Or interest rates were too high or low. That's the reason why. And it's probably not all the other or some external factor. So that's one reason. The other big bucket is what I call the volunteerist approach. And what I mean by the volunteerist is you volunteer to get out because you recognize there are not enough resources, or the resources that are there are being wasted. So then you elect or you volunteer to get out. So there you're taking a look at yourself, you're taking a look at the business, not externalizing. And the other is what I call the emotive approach. So the emotive approach is sometimes you simply lose interest. So you were excited at one point in time, you had a lot of energy, and then now you're just like struggling to stay engaged, struggling to stay, passionate about this. So I think those are three reasons why entrepreneurs fail.
That's a great point. Was there anything else you wanted to address on the failure side, or because I also wanted to move on and talk about lessons learned from failure?
The only thing I would say is that if you fail once, then that's okay. Because many people, and you probably know better than I, is they may have a series of failures. And I want to normalize the failure experience, particularly in an academic culture where a lot of people, they get upset if they get a 98 on the test rather than 100 on the test. So if you got a 98, you still got an A+, why are you bothered about the other 2 points? So you have to get some degree of comfort with failure. But to your point is, if you do fail, then are there lessons to be learned from that when you get back on the horse and maybe try something different or try it again?
So the old adage is you'll learn more from your failures than your successes sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's true. But here's the condition, only if you reflect upon it. So if you just fail and then you forget it, or you fail and then you blame it on everybody else or blame it on the environment, then there's no lesson to be learned. But you have to reflect.
Yeah, that's right. Otherwise, you're just moving right on to the next disaster without really any lesson learned from the previous mistake that you made.
Precisely. Yeah.
Well, I think the landscape is littered with entrepreneurs. Do you know just a quick side story. You know, Mark Cuban on Shark
Yeah.
Tank. Do you know his very first business was that he
No.
failed miserably at? He thought he was going to corner the market on powdered milk.
Really?
Right. Powdered milk. And that obviously must not have gone very well for him.
Must not have.
No, and he was also a bartender in college, but the problem was he wanted to buy the bar, but he wasn't
Oh,
21 years old.
right.
So in Texas, that was a small problem for him. So
Yeah.
that one didn't work out. He
Yep.
obviously did very well after that, but you know, broadcast.com where he made his bucks, that was about his fourth venture after the other
Oh,
didn't work
yep.
out. And
Yep.
he's
So he
still a
found
pretty young guy too.
yes,
So he's not done, that's for sure.
he's not done. Yep. And found his sweet spot.
Yeah.
I never knew about the powdered milk. I would have
Yeah.
never imagined.
In fact,
Yeah.
the students did a presentation on him, and that was
Yeah.
in the presentation. I didn't even know it. So
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
great example of you students teaching us faculty a few things.
Precisely. Yeah.
We're constantly learning from you.
Yep. It's a two-way street.
Well, Marty, I want to be respectful of our time. One other thing that you'd mentioned to me, if there was a friend of yours out in Central Valley in California,
Yep.
you want to kind of wrap up by sharing a little bit of his story, and then I think that'd be great.
Yep. So let me talk a little bit about this. So it's a colleague of mine that's a geriatrician that provides services in long-term care facilities, senior apartments, and senior centers and assisted living centers. So this population is between 65 and 95, older population. So about maybe 4 or 5 months ago, we were talking about telehealth. So how does he launch telehealth? And how does he provide services and scale up beyond the Fresno and the Central Valley area? So he was somewhat procrastinating because it wasn't urgent. So COVID-19 appears, and then within the period of about 2 weeks, there's some urgency that's here. So when you think about challenging times and difficult times, there's also a silver lining, if you will. There's opportunity that's within that if you can recognize the opportunity and seize the opportunity. So what he's doing right now is trying to really develop this telehealth intervention in order to determine whether he can actually make it work. And if he does, then he can scale it to other counties. So I think that's very important because all of us may go through a personal struggle, we may go through a health struggle, we may go through a family struggle, or in the case of epidemics and pandemics, a global struggle. So be upset, be nervous, be fearful, be maybe a little bit depressed, that's okay. But please sit back and ask yourself, the question is, what opportunities might be there? Because things are so radically different. And what you will find is that's the time to actually come up with a different way of delivering something or delivering something different. So I'm not talking about gouging and profiteering, but trying to meet the needs of people in a unique and novel way, but also during trying times, people have different needs.
Well, that's a great point. Very topical for where we're at, Marty. So I want to thank you for your time today. I guess the one other thing I would just piggyback on your last comment, there are a lot of people being very entrepreneurial right now, even the city of Chicago, which is not necessarily known for that, but
Yes.
them converting hotels to hospitals, I think is a great example of thinking very creatively and out of the
Definitely.
box, which is a skill set. Not all, it's, you know, entrepreneurship's not just about starting businesses. It's a skill set of thinking innovatively and creatively. And then
Yes.
To wrap up this segment, the lessons learned that go along with that, that might come from failure or crisis or other things, to just
Yes.
be positive and move forward.
Right.
Any
And thank you.
any final points?
I guess a final point is that when you think about failure or failure kind of comes to your door, don't personalize it. Because I can think of hardly anyone, actually no one, that hasn't experienced some failure in their life. And that's okay. But pause and try to reflect upon it and try not to make the same mistake over and over and over again. And if other people have a failure experience, try to have some compassion, some understanding. Don't hold people to perfection at all the time. That's unrealistic because probably 99.999% of us are not perfect all the time.
That's great. Well, thank you, Professor Marty Martin from
You're
DePaul.
welcome.
Be safe and hang
I
in there.
shall.
We'll all get through this together.
We will. Take
All
it
right.
easy.
You too.